What a crowd. Wonderful to be here. So I want to talk to you this morning about how democracies can defend themselves from against threats from within. Democracies don't die like they used to. Democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns, of generals attacking democracy violently. Today, most democracies die at the hands of elected politicians, presidents and prime ministers who, once in power, use the very instruments of democracy to kill it. This is Hugo Chavez, this is Viktor Orban, this is Erdogan in Turkey. This means that the principal threats to democracy today come from within. Now, it's true that democracies are always vulnerable to threats from within because democracy requires broad freedom and open competition, which inevitably leaves it vulnerable to anti-democratic forces. So a democracy can't fully humanize itself from threats from within without ceasing to be a democracy. But there's a dramatic increase in the number of anti-democratic figures in the world today. Chavez, Erdogan, Orban, Modi, Bolsonaro, and Donald Trump. So it's very important to think about how to protect a democracy from such figures. Now, to reflect on these themes, I want to begin today by talking about the United States, but I will end today by thinking more generally about what lessons we can learn from the American experience for Europe, for Germany more generally. So I don't think it's very controversial to say that American democracy faces real challenges today. America is experiencing what political scientists call democratic backsliding. This is not severe backsliding, not like the kind of backsliding that has come to Hungary or to Turkey, but every international index that ranks democracies notes that there's been a pretty significant decline in the quality of American democracy since 2016. Freedom House, an international organization, has a global democracy index, which scores all countries from a low of 0 to a high of 100. A decade ago, the United States received a score of 94 out of 100, which put the United States in the same league with Canada, Germany, Great Britain. Today, the US's score is 83, which is tied with Romania and 2 points below Argentina. Now, this is pretty shocking, but when you have government efforts to restrict the right to vote, when you have violent attacks on election workers, and when you have a president who tries to block the peaceful transfer of power, you reach a point where Freedom House gives you a score lower than Argentina. Now, that this has even happened is really shocking from a social scientist point of view. I'm a political scientist, and political scientists disagree about everything, but there's two things they agree on. The first is that rich democracies never die. No country with a GDP per capita of over $17,000 per year in the 20th or 21st centuries has ever broken down. The United States is 5 times that level. The second seemingly rock-solid finding is that old democracies never die. In the 20th and 21st centuries, no democracy over the age of 50 has ever broken down. Even if we say the United States became a democracy in 1965 when full voting rights were extended, America's democracy is over 50 years old. So the fact that there's a crisis in American democracy today is really a puzzle. Unique among its peer nations, other rich old democracies, only the United States has experienced democratic backsliding. Even though there are radical right parties, there's threats to democracy everywhere, only has this really happened so far in the United States. So how has one of the world's oldest and richest democracies become so vulnerable? So in our book, Tyranny, the Minority, we focus on 2 causes. Number 1, the radicalization of the Republican Party. And second, a set of political institutions that are making this problem worse. So we talk about each point. I'll talk about each point briefly. So democracy can't survive if one of its major parties is not committed to democracy. Now, I want to be clear about what I mean by a commitment to democracy. So we make a point in our book, and I think this also travels to Europe and to Germany, that to be a politician or a political party committed to democracy means you have to do three things, three very basic things. Number one, you have to be able to accept election results, whether or not you win. You have to unambiguously reject the use of political violence. And third, you must break completely with violent or anti-democratic forces. Those first two principles are pretty straightforward. The third one deserves a little more explanation. Openly authoritarian figures can't kill a democracy on their own. They need mainstream accomplices, or what the great Spanish political scientist called semi-loyal Democrats. Semi-loyal Democrats are regular politicians. In the German edition of our book, the translator called them halbloyale Demokraten. I've sometimes thought a better term would be lauwarme Demokraten. They put on suits, they work inside the Capitol building. They're not the ones attacking the Capitol building. But their semi-loyalty manifests itself when authoritarian threats emerge within their own camp. When faced with anti-democratic extremists within their own camp, loyal Democrats do three things. They publicly condemn anti-democratic behavior. They expel anti-democratic forces from their ranks, refusing to nominate them or to include them in their party. And crucially, they join forces with parties and groups on the other side of the political aisle, on the other side of the political spectrum, join forces to isolate the anti-democratic extremists. Now, the lauwarme Demokraten, or the semi-loyalists, do none of these things. They collaborate with extremists, or they simply remain silent. Now, semi-loyalty sometimes looks pretty benign, but it poses a clear threat to democracy because it legitimates, emboldens, and empowers extremists. In our studies of democratic breakdown in the 1920s and 30s in Europe, the 1960s and 70s in Latin America, there's a very crystal clear lesson. And that lesson is that when mainstream parties of the left or the right protect and enable violent or anti-democratic extremists, democracy gets into trouble. So let's turn back to the United States. In the United States, there's a substantial segment of voters, roughly 30% of voters, who support a radical anti-democratic force. This is the core of the Trump or the MAGA base, as it's sometimes called, Make America Great, the MAGA base. Now, where does this 30% come from in the United States? Well, over the past 30 years, America has changed dramatically. It has become much more ethnically and culturally diverse. The percentage of Americans who identified themselves as white and Christian fell from 80% in 1976 to 43% in 2016. This is a dramatic transformation. As American society has transformed, the Republican Party has not. It has remained predominantly, until now, a white and Christian party in a rapidly diversifying country. So this has two big implications for the Republican Party. And I think this is crucial to understand where we are in the United States. The first is that social changes have posed an electoral threat to the Republican Party. In an incredibly diverse society, it's really hard for a primarily white and Christian party to win majorities. Indeed, the Republican Party hasn't actually won a popular majority for the presidency since 2004. A popular majority for the presidency since 2004. But the threat went beyond just elections. For important parts of the Republican Party's base, these changes have felt existential. America's transformation over the last 50 years, one that no democracy has ever undergone, is a transition in which a long dominant ethnic majority loses not only in its majority status, but loses its dominant social status in society. There's a perception that exists among the hardcore of the MAGA or Trump base that the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. That's a powerful perception of existential threat, powerful enough for people to turn against democracy. The Trump movement can be regarded as a reaction against the diversifying America. And I think a similar fear also fuels the radical right in Europe today. But again, remember, the Trump base is only 30% of America. And in fact, around 20 to 30% of voters in all Western societies seem to be supportive of radical right parties. The number is sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but it's a near constant across Western democracies in Germany, Italy, Sweden, Netherlands, Austria, and the United States. This 30% is very similar everywhere. So the question, though, is why does this 30% faction have such a grip on American politics? There are two reasons, I think. First, the semi-loyal leadership of the Republican Party, the leadership, has turned the party into an enabler, empowering this base. The leadership of the Republican Party has repeatedly failed in its gatekeeping role and allowed an anti-democratic force to the top of American politics. This happened in 2016 when Republican leaders nominated Donald Trump to be their candidate for their party. This happened in 2021 when the Republican Party failed to complete the impeachment of Donald Trump, and this is happening right now as we speak in 2024 as well. Semi-loyal Democrats within the Republican Party, just out of career motivations often, they don't want to destroy democracy, just out of career motivations, have put democracy at risk. This should be a warning, I would say, to Germans and Europeans about the dangers of lauwarme Demokraten. So that's one reason this 30% is so powerful. A second reason is something distinctive to the United States, in particular, the structure of our political institutions. The United States, we've just been celebrating the German Constitution the last few days here. The United States has an 18th century Constitution. Certain features of it are wonderful and deserve to be admired, but it was written in a pre-democratic era. It was designed in part to protect against the tyranny of the majority. But it has actually now generated the opposite problem. More so than any other democracy on earth, the US Constitution prevents electoral majorities often from winning power, and when they win power, often prevents majorities from governing. Now, many of you probably know of these institutions, the famous Electoral College, the Wahlmännerkollegium, which is the indirect system by which we pick our president, which often allows the loser of the popular vote to become president. A Senate which provides equal representation for each state, no matter the size of the state. So Wyoming, a state with 500,000 voters or citizens, and California with 40 million citizens, both have 2 senators. And then the Senate filibuster, which is this rule inside the Senate that requires that 60% of senators have to vote on anything and for anything to become a law in the United States. And then you add to this, finally, the Supreme Court. The United States is the only national court system in the world in which one can be appointed to the judge and serve for one's entire lifetime, which means that judges picked a generation ago can thwart the will of majorities today. Now, many of these institutions were designed by founders with this vision of protecting against majorities, but many of them were not. Many of these institutions were simply the result of compromise and improvisation in a difficult founding moment. And these compromises built a bias into our political system that overrepresented rural areas. This wasn't by design. Electoral College, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. Now, this rural bias has basically always been there, but it never seriously advantaged one political party over another, because for most of American history, both political parties had urban and rural wings. It's only in the 21st century where the parties have split, where the Democratic Party is the party of urban areas, and the Republican Party is the party of rural areas. So what this now means is that the Electoral College, the Senate, and the Supreme Court overrepresent Republicans. This means the Republican Party can actually win power without actually winning majorities. This gives an artificial boost to the Trump movement, because these institutions inflate the power of the Trump movement. So just to give you one example, take the presidency. The Democratic Party has won the popular vote for the presidency every year except for one since 1988. 1988. When I describe this to my 15 and 14-year-old daughters, I say the Republican Party has only won the popular vote for the presidency one time since Taylor Swift was born. They get the point. Similar story can be told about the Senate. The federal judiciary is a system, our court system. We have 3 of our current Supreme Court justices were appointed by a president who didn't win the popular vote and was confirmed by a Senate that didn't represent a majority of Americans. So the point here is these unusual institutions make it very easy for a political minority to govern, easier than any place in the world among democracies. And what this means also is that many things that Americans value in opinion polls, we see support for gun control, support for abortion rights, support for more aggressive policies to deal with poverty. These things keep getting blocked by our institutions, and this frustrates people. A second point I would make is these institutions actually reinforce the radicalization of the Republican Party, because the Republican Party doesn't actually have to win majorities in order to win power. And so extremism, the extremism that we see in the Republican Party today, doesn't hurt the party as it would if there was really free competition. The Republican Party can win the presidency with only 46% of the vote, as it did in 2016. If Republicans actually had to win majorities, the leadership would have to rein in the extremism that we see today. Okay, so what do we do about all of this? This is the thing that occupies a lot of my time and lots of other people's times in the United States. We say in our book, Tyranny of the Minority, that we need to begin a process of major institutional change. We need to democratize our democracy. We need to update our 18th century Constitution. This has happened in the past, I should say. There's been updates, but not very many. So in our book, we have 15 proposals. I won't go through all of them, but some of these things include abolish the Electoral College. We're the only democracy in the world today still with an Electoral College for selecting a president. Democratize the Senate by eliminating this weird institution, the filibuster. Establish term limits for Supreme Court justices. Make it easier to vote. We vote on Tuesdays. Nobody can get to the ballot. Most governments try to make it easier to vote. In the United States, it's often people seem to make it harder to vote. Now, these are all long-term projects, and none of this is going to change before November 2024. I think it's important that they're on the political agenda. So the question is, what should happen between now and November, when this presidential election, this fateful presidential election, is approaching? And what to do now in Germany? Are there lessons about how to confront similar threats? Because the threat to democracy in both the United States and Germany is actually quite similar. The Trump movement and the AfD in Germany are very similar. In both instances, they would represent a shock to the political system if they were to actually gain power. So how to defend against this in the short run? So I'll close by describing 4 general strategies. They each have their strengths and weaknesses, but these are the options on the menu, I would say. The first is the classical laissez-faire or liberal American response. The classical liberal says, let all ideas compete. Don't use physical force or the state to silence outrageous voices. Let the electoral marketplace work. Let good ideas beat bad ideas. Let good candidates beat bad candidates. Now, this is a powerful perspective, and I subscribe to it in part, but the problem with this view is that it leaves our systems vulnerable to demagogues who will cheat. It's not a free and fair competition always, who will use the very institutions of democracy to damage democracy. So in response to this, there's a second approach, and this is an approach that's very familiar in Germany, that emerged out of the experience in the 1930s. And this is the tradition of wehrhafte Demokratie, or in English it's translated militant democracy. Now the core idea here is that you need to use the state, the rule of law, in a top-down fashion to differentiate between acceptable speech and unacceptable speech, acceptable political parties, unacceptable political parties. And after a legal process, ultimately, be in a position to potentially ban dangerous debate or parties. In other words, use the rule of law to exclude anti-democratic forces from the electoral marketplace. Now, this tradition, of course, has been very consequential in post-war Germany. It centers around debates around the AfD in Germany today. It's been recently used in Brazil. The Supreme Electoral Court banned last year former President Bolsonaro from running for president again. Now, this tradition is very powerful, but it too has limits. Because if legal guardrails aren't in place, how do we guarantee that the democracy protects itself from the abuse of these incredibly powerful tools? So this too is an incomplete strategy. A third strategy for confronting authoritarianism within a democracy is to build big electoral coalitions, to isolate and defeat anti-democratic extremists, political coalitions. Now, this too has its roots in history. In the 1930s in Belgium, the Catholics and socialists who hated each other about lots of things and disagreed about lots of things joined together to form a government to defeat the fascists. What this broad political strategy means in the United States today is that in November 2024, Liz Cheney, a very extreme conservative, but who's committed to democracy, needs to join together with Bernie Sanders, a democratic socialist, who's also committed to democracy. And that there needs to be a broad coalition. This is in part how Biden got elected in 2020. And unfortunately, in some sense, this kind of coalition is necessary again. Within Germany, this broad coalition means in places like Thüringen, where there's 30% of the vote voting for the AfD, we have to remember 70% of the vote is not. And that CDU and the Linke Partei maybe don't like each other very much, but they share a commitment to democracy, and they need to join forces. Now, what I would say about this third political strategy is that it is, in fact, good, but only in the short run. In the long run, it's a very dangerous strategy because it only reinforces the narrative that mainstream parties are excluding the outsiders. Over the long run, it's insufficient. But it's, in some sense, the last off-ramp before allowing an authoritarian party into power. So this leaves finally one last strategy, one which I'll call a strategy of social mobilization. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, one response to the dilemma of how to deal with an anti-democratic force in a democracy is to mobilize social forces in favor of democracy. This means community organizations, neighborhood meetings. This means business associations and labor unions joining together. This means religious organizations publicly defending democracy and condemning extremism, and this may even mean people in the streets. This means, in short, civil society of all types, liberal, social democratic, green, and conservative. Business leaders, religious leaders, labor leaders all have an absolutely critical role to play to join forces in the broadest social coalitions possible to confidently assert what is allowed in our societies and what is not, reminding citizens of our shared democratic norms, reminding them where the red lines are, and when the red lines begin to fade, to repaint the red lines. This, in fact, is what has been happening in Germany over the last 5 months, since early January of this year. As an outsider looking from the United States, I have found it inspiring. Now, I know it's not enough, and people get tired of going to demonstrations, and it's really hard work to hold together very heterogeneous groups when you have bankers who have never participated in a demonstration in their life marching alongside anti-fascist students. There's going to be a lot of disagreements. They're going to disagree about a lot of things. But it's absolutely crucial that they respect each other and understand they share a commitment to democracy. In the civil rights era in the 1960s, there was a famous folk song from Pete Seeger that was an inspiration for the civil rights movement. And the key line in that song was, "Keep your eye on the prize. Keep your eye on the prize." And what was meant by that was, despite all of the infighting, despite all of the challenges, remember what's essential. And I think in this case, having a broad political and social commitment to democracy is essential. Remembering that, I think, is key in determining the fate of our democracies. Thank you.